When the judge saw me step into the courtroom, he froze. The same man who once signed the paper that destroyed my career now whispered, almost in disbelief, "Ambrosia Fairchild, why are you here?" I didn't answer. I just placed my old leather case on the table. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot, the kind that wakes buried ghosts. Across the aisle, my former daughter-in-law smiled, that cold, polished smile I'd seen before, the one that comes right before betrayal. My son sat in silence, the weight of shame on his shoulders, because even he didn't know the truth about who I used to be. 20 years ago, I lost everything to corruption wearing a badge and a robe. Today, I came back to the very place that buried me, not for revenge, but to make them remember what justice sounds like. I had sworn I would never step inside a courtroom again, especially not one presided over by Ellis Monroe. 20 years had passed since the morning he signed the order that erased my name from the walls of justice. I'd promised myself, Ambrosia, never go back. And yet there I was, standing in the cold light of the Dallas County Courthouse. My son sat at the defense table, his hands trembling as if every breath carried the weight of a lifetime. Across from him sat his wife, Madeline Quinn, flawless in her burgundy dress, lips the color of betrayal. Beside her, Charlotte Brooks adjusted her blazer with surgical precision, the same woman I once taught how to question a witness without losing her soul. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to cut through the silence. Reporters lined the benches, craning their necks as I walked past, heels tapping against the marble floor. I didn't look at them. My eyes stayed fixed on Monroe. When he finally raised his head, the color drained from his face. "Ambrosia Fairchild?" He rose halfway from his chair, voice cracking like old glass. "Why are you here?" The room froze. Even the whispering stopped. Madeline turned, confusion flickering into fear. Charlotte's jaw tightened, her confidence flickering for the briefest second. Nathan swallowed hard, gripping the handle of his cane until his knuckles turned white. I reached the table, laid my worn leather case down, and the sound of it striking the wood echoed through the courtroom, sharp, final, unshakable. "Because justice brought me back," I said, every word steady as stone. No one else moved. They couldn't. They didn't know what hid inside that case. Papers, yes, but not just papers. Buried beneath the files lay the evidence of 2 decades of silence, the pieces of a truth I'd carried alone, and the storm I was about to release into this room. I slid into the chair beside my son. His hand found mine under the table, fingers trembling. I squeezed back, not as comfort, but as a promise. He thought this was his trial, but as I looked into the eyes of the man who had destroyed my past, I understood something far deeper. This courtroom wasn't only here to judge him, it had finally called me back to judge myself. I used to believe justice couldn't be bought until the day it was sold with my husband's signature. 20 years ago, I was a federal prosecutor in Houston, a woman too stubborn to bend and too proud to fear. My biggest case was Operation Blue Coyote, a cross-border drug network that swallowed half the city's law enforcement in bribes. I worked the case for months, chasing trails of cash, coded calls, and silence. Then I found a name I never expected to see. Victor Fairchild, my husband, the city's police chief. I remember the night I turned in the report, rain hitting the courthouse windows, thunder rolling like a verdict waiting to be read. I told myself I was doing the right thing, that the law would protect its own. By dawn, the headline screamed otherwise. Federal prosecutor Ambrosia Fairchild leaks classified files. The betrayal came faster than the storm. My badge was taken. My phone stopped ringing. Colleagues who once toasted me at conferences wouldn't meet my eyes in the hallway, and the man I'd shared my bed with every night, Victor, never said a word in my defense. The investigation order bore a familiar signature, Ellis Monroe, Deputy Chief Judge at the time, the same man who'd once called me the future of American justice. That signature cut deeper than any accusation. The case was buried. Victor was promoted, and I was stripped of my license. I packed what was left of my life into 2 boxes and drove to Austin, where no one knew my name. I opened a small coffee shop on a quiet street, fair and bright, a bitter joke that only I understood. Customers came and went. I didn't care. All that mattered was raising my son. Nathan. He believed in me the way children believe in heroes. My mom used to fight bad guys, he'd tell his teachers. I smiled every time, though I knew the truth. That hero had been dragged through the mud and left to rot. The years blurred together. Monroe became a federal judge in Dallas. Victor remarried a Florida businesswoman and scrubbed my name from his resume. I became invisible, a ghost with a steady hand and a quiet shop. Until one morning, fate came back wrapped in a newspaper. The headline read, "Judge Ellis Monroe to preside over Whitmore Energy divorce case." Whitmore. The name hit like a hammer. Darren Whitmore, son of the man who had secretly funded the Blue Coyote operation in 1998. 2 decades later, they were all standing in court again, under the same roof. Only this time, I wasn't on trial. I was being summoned by the very ghosts that thought I'd never return. Nathan grew into everything I'd once hoped for, a man who built something from nothing. His renewable energy startup was small but promising, and for the first time since Houston, I felt proud again. Then came Madeline Quinn, smart, polished, from one of Dallas's oldest legal families. She was everything my son thought he needed, refined, confident, dazzling enough to make him forget how fragile success can be. On their wedding day, I watched her smile as she slipped the ring on his finger, and I let myself believe he'd found the happiness I never could. That illusion didn't last. 2 years later, an explosion tore through his construction site. Nathan lived, but the blast left him paralyzed from the waist down. Overnight, my son went from a visionary entrepreneur to a man trapped inside his own home. And slowly, I began to notice how Madeline's compassion hardened into something colder. She started traveling for work, her excuses multiplying as quickly as her designer bags. Her phone was always face down, always locked. One night, driving home from the shop, I saw her parked under a streetlight, leaning close to a man in a tailored suit, Darren Whitmore. The light caught her face just long enough for me to see the truth. Her smile was thin, calculated, a blade disguised as affection. I said nothing. 3 weeks later, she filed for divorce. The petition demanded half the assets, full custody of Ella, my 8-year-old granddaughter, and a restraining clause to keep Nathan from creating emotional distress. My son barely spoke for days. He stared out the window like a man already buried. When the papers arrived, I sat at the kitchen table and read every word. Near the end, I found a signature I knew too well, Charlotte Brooks, attorney of record. It took me a moment to breathe. Charlotte had once been my intern, the bright young woman who'd written in her thesis, "To Ambrosia Fairchild, who taught me that truth has a heartbeat." And now she was defending the woman trying to destroy my son. I closed the file and looked in the mirror above the sink. The woman staring back wasn't broken anymore. Her eyes were older, sharper, like glass tempered by fire. After 20 years of silence, I finally whispered the words I'd been too afraid to say. It's time to return to court. I still remember the day the divorce papers came. The envelope sat on the counter like a warning. Inside, in bold capital letters, it read, petition for divorce, mental unfitness, and marital failure. I read those words again and again until my hands started to shake. They weren't just asking to end a marriage. They were calling my son insane, unfit to be a father. Nathan sat by the window, his legs motionless, his face drained of everything but exhaustion. "I don't want to fight her, Mom," he said quietly. "It's over. I already lost." I put a hand on his shoulder. "You only lose when you stop telling the truth." A few days later, Madeline showed up with Charlotte Brooks. Charlotte, sharp as glass, colder than I remembered. And standing behind them was a man I'd never met, Darren Whitmore. Silver hair, tailored suit, the kind of smile that hides a knife. "Mrs. Fairchild," Charlotte began crisply, "we're here to discuss a settlement. If Nathan agrees to sign, this can all end peacefully." Her voice was steady, professional, too professional. I could almost see the young intern she once was, trembling before a witness in my old office. "Charlotte," I said softly, "when I trained you, I told you, justice is never for sale. Did you forget that?" She looked away. Darren stepped forward, tone smooth as oil. "I'm only trying to help Madeline secure her future. Nathan isn't in any condition to manage a company, is he?" I met his gaze, calm but sharp enough to cut. "And you," I said, "are trying to buy one by stepping over a man who can't walk." The air turned to ice. Madeline laughed under her breath. "At least he can do what Nathan can't. Move on." They left the papers on the kitchen table and walked out. When I went to pick them up, something caught my eye: Charlotte's signature. A long curve at the end of the S. Deliberate and elegant. I froze. I'd taught her that flourish myself, an old trick to distinguish originals from forgeries. That mark wasn't for Madeline's benefit, it was for hers. That night, while passing the hallway, I heard Madeline's voice on the phone. "He's losing it, Charlotte. Soon the company will be mine." "Be careful," Charlotte whispered. "If his mother suspects anything, she'll destroy you." I hit record. Every word spilled like poison. They weren't planning a divorce. They were dismantling my son's life, piece by piece, transferring his shares to Whitmore. I turned toward the shelf, my eyes landing on the old leather case. I hadn't opened it in 20 years. That night, I did. Inside was my faded law ID and a note I once scribbled in anger and hope. Justice doesn't die. It waits. For the first time in 2 decades, my anger didn't feel like a wound. It felt like power. I needed proof, not stories, not suspicions, proof that could make a courtroom kneel. There was only one man I trusted with that kind of truth: Reuben Miles, my former investigator. He lived in a shabby apartment in Austin, the air thick with cigarette smoke and regret. When he saw me at the door, he smirked. "Ambrosia Fairchild, I thought justice buried you." I smiled back. "Justice doesn't bury people. Reuben, it buries lies." I told him everything: Madeline, Darren, Charlotte, the forged signature. He listened in silence, smoke curling between his fingers. "Whitmore," he said finally. "He's dirtier than oil. His name's all over bribery circles." 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived. Inside was a copy of a contract between Madeline Quinn and Darren Whitmore, signed at LaRue, Dallas. It stated, in the event of marital dissolution, Ms. Quinn will transfer 51% of Fairchild Renewables to Whitmore Energy for $5 million. And at the bottom, Charlotte Brooks, witness. Reuben called me that night. "I've got a witness too, a waiter named Cal Weaver, former Marine. Says he remembers you. You defended him years ago under the Veterans Act. He's willing to testify." I sat there, frozen. 20 years ago, I saved a soldier's life. Now another was about to save my son's. The circle of justice was turning back to me. Later that night, I replayed the phone recording again. Madeline's voice, clear and venomous. Once Nathan's ruled unstable, Darren will take over. Then Charlotte's weary sigh. And what about Ambrosia? Madeline's laugh, cold, final. She's just an old woman who used to matter. I paused the audio, turned the volume up. Beneath the clinking glasses was another voice, low, male, older. "Keep Monroe quiet. I'll handle her if she appears." My stomach dropped. I knew that voice, even distorted by years and whiskey. It was unmistakable. Victor Fairchild, my ex-husband. The man who'd cost me everything. He was still out there, hiding in the shadows, pulling strings. I closed the laptop, my hands shaking, but my voice steady in the silence. "They started this in Houston 20 years ago. I'll finish it in Dallas." I gathered the files, the recording, the contract, and slid them into my leather case. Tomorrow, I'd walk back into the place that once buried me. Not as a victim's mother, but as the lawyer truth had been waiting for. The first day of Fairchild v. Quinn felt like the whole county had packed itself into that room. I walked in with Nathan at my side, his hand tight on the wooden cane, my old leather case a familiar weight at my hip. Madeline glided in like she belonged at a gala. Charlotte trailed behind with that same controlled, chilly poise. When the judge took the bench, his eyes found me, and something unreadable moved across his face. Regret, fear, memory. Charlotte opened with a practiced line about emotional distress, and the room hung on her words. She lifted a photo of Nathan in his chair and framed him as unfit. I stood and cut through it. I produced the power of attorney Nathan had signed. The murmur went through the courtroom like a current. Cameras flashed. Charlotte's composure cracked. Madeline's smile thinned. Later, during the break, I saw him, leaning in the back, silver hair, a presence that made the air colder. Victor. He didn't need to shout. His glance said it all. "You shouldn't have come back." In that look, I understood the fight extended well beyond these benches. We reconvened the next morning under a pale wash of light. Charlotte began to speak again until I set a small USB on the desk and asked the court to play it. Madeline's voice filled the room, coaching a child, threats disguised as strategy. Ella's tiny protest came through, raw and true. The courtroom shifted. Madeline lurched to her feet, calling it fabrication. Reuben then approached with the original device and a carrier's timestamp. Verification from someone who'd listened with more than ears. The defense's thread of certainty started to fray. Then Cal Weaver took the stand, a former Marine in a server's apron who placed ink on the contract that tied Whitmore to Quinn, and, shockingly, a familiar name beside his. He swore he'd seen them sign the transfer of shares. Silence swallowed the room. Charlotte's face crumpled. Madeline's color drained. The next morning's headlines were already being written in the hushed space between the judge's gavel and my steady pulse. That morning, the courthouse in Dallas was overflowing. Reporters crowded the steps, flashes cutting through the thick Texas air. I could hear people murmuring as I walked past, "The woman who once shook the justice system is back." I wore a gray suit that had seen better years. Not to impress anyone, but to remind myself why I'd come. Not for fame, not for vindication, for justice. Nathan sat beside me at the defense table, his hand trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. Across the aisle, Madeline avoided my eyes, her heavy makeup cracking beneath the heat of the cameras. Charlotte sat beside her, silent, shoulders rigid, the exhaustion in her eyes betraying what her lips refused to say, and above them all, on the bench, Judge Ellis Monroe looked down, his expression caught between shame and something that looked dangerously close to repentance. "Ms. Fairchild," he said softly, "you may proceed." I opened the leather case, the same one that had once followed me through 100 trials. Inside were neatly arranged documents: the original contract, Rubin's verified evidence, the audio file, and a letter I had written the night before. A letter meant for myself, should the world turn against me again. I placed them on the table. 20 years ago, Your Honor, you told me that silence keeps order in a courtroom. Today, I say silence keeps injustice alive. The room fell still. Every breath felt heavy. I began my statement, my voice calm but cutting through the air like a blade. This isn't about a divorce. It's about a cycle of greed that devours the innocent. My son's company, his family, his dignity, each stripped away by the same corruption that once took my career. And it began, Your Honor, under your watch. Monroe's gaze dropped. The room barely breathed. Madeline's chair scraped against the floor as she stood. "This is slander." I met her eyes. "No, Mrs. Quinn, this is evidence." The door opened, and Rubin walked in, carrying a sealed folder. He laid it before the bench, the secret contract linking Madeline, Darren, and Victor Fairchild, complete with fingerprints. A forensic analyst confirmed the match aloud: Victor's. A collective gasp rolled through the courtroom like a wave. Cameras clicked furiously, reporters shouting over one another. "Victor Fairchild implicated in corporate bribery scandal." Monroe's voice trembled slightly when he spoke again. "The court acknowledges the evidence as legitimate. Mrs. Fairchild, please continue." I turned back to the room. "Justice doesn't die," I said. "It waits, and it waited for this day." Nathan broke down, covering his face as tears slipped through his fingers. For years he'd believed his family name stood for disgrace. Now, for the first time, it stood for truth. Charlotte rose slowly, her voice thin but trembling with something honest. "I was wrong. I let ambition blind me. I'm sorry. Ambrosia." I gave her a single nod. "Then make it right." She walked to the prosecution's table, pulled a document from her briefcase, and handed it to the clerk, a formal withdrawal from the case, accompanied by a file of internal communications between Darren Whitmore and Madeline Quinn. Madeline's face twisted in disbelief. "You traitor!" she screamed, before her knees buckled. The bailiff caught her just as she collapsed into the chair, pale and gasping. Monroe lifted the gavel, his hand visibly shaking. "The court will proceed to verdict tomorrow morning." The sound of the gavel echoed across the chamber like the closing of a chapter that had taken 20 years to write. As I stepped outside, the sunlight struck my face, blinding and warm. Cameras flashed, microphones reached for my voice, questions flying like arrows. "Mrs. Fairchild, are you seeking revenge or justice?" I stopped for a moment, turned toward the crowd, and said quietly, "Revenge fades, justice echoes." Then I walked down the courthouse steps, the crowd parting around me, the hum of voices fading into the wind. For the first time in 2 decades, my hands were steady. Tomorrow, the law would speak again, and this time, it would speak the truth. Dallas held its breath. The courthouse steps were crowded, the air thick with anticipation as the city waited for the outcome of Fairchild v. Quinn. Inside, the courtroom was silent, so silent I could hear the faint hum of the ceiling lights. When Judge Ellis Monroe entered, he didn't glance at the press or the lawyers lined along the aisle. His eyes went straight to me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then his voice, steady but trembling, cut through the stillness. "For the record, this court recognizes Ms. Ambrosia Fairchild as legal counsel for the respondent. Nathan Fairchild. The verdict follows. The papers in his hands rustled as he began to read. Nathan Fairchild retains full ownership of Fairchild Renewables and sole custody of his daughter, Ella Fairchild. The words hit me like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Nathan exhaled sharply beside me, his hand clutching mine beneath the table. Madeline Quinn, Monroe continued, is restricted from contacting her child except under supervised visitation. Madeline lowered her head, the mask of defiance gone, her carefully crafted image dissolving into nothing but the sound of her own shallow breathing. Charlotte Brooks, Monroe read on, is hereby suspended from practicing law for 2 years, though the court acknowledges her cooperation in disclosing evidence critical to this case. Charlotte bowed her head. Tears fell quietly onto her folded hands. Darren Whitmore, he said next, is charged with bribery, fraud, and conspiracy to commit corporate theft. The gallery erupted in whispers. The flash of cameras flickered like lightning, and then Monroe paused. His next words came slower, heavier. Victor Fairchild is now under federal investigation and subject to an active warrant for aiding and abetting money laundering. The room went completely still. Reporters froze mid-sentence. I felt the air shift, the ghost of my past finally given a name, a consequence, a reckoning. When Monroe lowered the file, he looked straight at me. The weight of 2 decades pressed between us. Fairchild, he said softly, I owe you an apology for 20 years of silence. I met his gaze, my voice quiet but unwavering. The law didn't owe me your honor. It owed itself the truth. For a long moment, the entire courtroom seemed to breathe again. Monroe nodded, his lips tightening as tears welled in eyes too old to hide regret. Then, from the back of the room, a small voice broke the solemn air. "Grandma," Ella called out, "can we go home now?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, soft, genuine, the kind that mends what anger once tore apart. Even Monroe smiled, his gavel falling one last time, not as a sentence, but as a prayer. The echo of wood against wood lingered long after the sound was gone. Outside, the Texas sky was impossibly blue. Sunlight poured across the courthouse steps, and for the first time in 20 years, I felt the warmth of it without shame. The press surged forward, microphones outstretched. "Ms. Fairchild, you won the case. What's next for you?" I stopped, let the noise die down, and answered simply, winning was never the point. Restoring what's right was. As I turned toward the wide marble steps, I caught sight of the very door I had walked through 2 decades ago, the day I'd left this world behind in disgrace. Back then, I bowed my head as I walked away. Today, I lifted it high. The sunlight touched the silver strands of my hair as I stepped forward, and justice, after 20 long years, finally walked beside me. A year had passed. Austin was bathed in sunlight, the kind that made the sidewalks glow and turned every breath into something easy again. The breeze carried the scent of coffee and cinnamon from my new cafe, Truth and Coffee, its wooden sign swinging softly in the wind. Inside, the air was warm, gentle, alive with quiet chatter and the sound of spoons against porcelain. I sat behind the counter, finishing the last order of the day. My handwriting had steadied over time. The tremor I used to carry in my hands was gone. On the wall hung a photo, Nathan, Ella, and me at our elementary school graduation. Nathan stood tall now, walking on his own, the brace hidden beneath his pant leg. His smile, once heavy with pain, was light again. The bell over the door chimed, and Reuben stepped in, newspaper in hand and that same tired grin he'd worn since the day I met him. "Look who made the front page again," he said, setting the paper down on the counter. The headline stretched across the top. "Judge Monroe honors Ambrosia Fairchild in the Texas Hall of Justice." I laughed softly and began to pour him a cup of dark roast. "I told you, Reuben, justice doesn't die. It just needs a good cup of coffee to wake up." He chuckled, shaking his head. Still the same stubborn woman I knew. We sat in easy silence for a while, the kind that comes only when everything that needed to be said has already been spoken, a small pair of arms suddenly wrapped around my waist. "Grandma, can I help you today?" Ella's voice was bright, still filled with that gentle curiosity that had survived all the noise. I turned and smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You can start by turning the sign," I said, pointing to the board by the window. She skipped over and flipped it around. The words faced the street, catching the evening sun, "Where truth is served fresh daily." Outside, the bells of the old Texas church began to ring. Their sound drifted through the open door, mingling with the faint aroma of roasted beans. I leaned back, letting the moment settle, the peace, the laughter, the quiet rhythm of life finding its balance again. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the counter, landing on the glass display near the register. Inside, beneath soft light, sat my old leather case, its edges worn, the clasp faintly tarnished. The files inside were yellowed, the paper corners curled, but I kept them there as a reminder. I picked up my pen and opened my journal, writing slowly, the words flowing with ease. When I walked into that courtroom, I didn't just return to the law, I returned to myself. I closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and watched the city exhale with me. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the streets gold. For the first time in years, everything was still. The world no longer demanded that I fight, defend, or prove. It simply let me be. And in that golden quiet, just before the light disappeared completely, I heard it. The familiar sound I'd once feared and loved all at once. Thud. The soft final click of a leather case closing, the sound of justice completing its work.